Well, we have reached the top of the hour, and it is time to kick off the second of our Fireside Chats as part of our Voices of the Wilderness 2020, what we're calling our at-home edition of Voices of the Wilderness. Very sorry that we can't join together in person with our community, but certainly thinking about our community members and deciding not to do this event live and in person, but rather having this fantastic event that we've been able to have online. This is multi-pronged Voices of the Wilderness. We have an auction that started a week ago tonight and will run until a week from tonight, and we'll wrap up at 9:30 next Friday, or next Thursday night rather, on the 29th. So be sure and go to BMWF, as in Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation.org. And the banner across the top will take you both to that auction and that incredible art, gear, adventure trips, you name it. There's lots of things for you to bid on, knowing that every dollar that you spend in the auction will go to support our work in the Bob. Also through our website, you can find your way to our raffle. We are selling 400 tickets at $10 a piece for your chance to win a Kokopelli pack raft. One great way to experience the Bob would be on the water. And so we will be drawing for that next Friday, the 30th, but selling raffle tickets will end next Thursday night for that as well. So make sure you visit our website, bmwf.org, check out the auction, check out the raffle and your chance to win that Kokopelli pack raft. I think you'll find lots of things in that auction that you'll want to either hang on your wall or go experience yourself. It's our support from our community that makes our work possible. Without your support, we would not be able to partner with the United States Forest Service to help care for this incredible special place that we lovingly call the Bob. And so to our volunteers, to our donors, to our partners, we want to just say a special thank you as we celebrate 2020 and our Voices of the Wilderness event. 2020 has been a unique year for sure. COVID threw us some curveballs, as it has thrown all of us curveballs throughout the year. We were able to get a lot of great work done. We were not able to get as many volunteers in the woods as we would have liked, but out of an abundance of caution and an effort to not put additional pressure on frontline resources, we had a shortened volunteer season, but we did have a great year of getting work done in the Bob with our staff. We'd like to thank our Forest Service partners for helping facilitate what work we were able to get done for the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. I personally would love to thank the staff at the foundation, Rebecca, Allison, Meg, Sue, and our awesome board. Thank you for all you all do to make the work of the foundation go. And we're certainly excited to look into 2021, which will be the 25th year of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. How about that? 25 years of this foundation serving the complex with our agency partners side by side. Of course, in 2020, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. In 1939, Bob passed away at the very young age of 38, and in 1940, 3 primitive areas were designated as the Bob Marshall Wilderness in 1940. So celebrating 80 years this year, and next Thursday night at the same time, we will be having our third and final Fireside Chat. We'll be joined with about 7 different guests at night to look at the full history of the land, including kicking off a look at the native perspectives on the land. Of course, when we talk about the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, we're talking about a place that is also the home of the Salish, Kootenai, and Blackfeet people, and we should never fail to recognize that. And we will kick off next Thursday night with a conversation with Jesse DeRozier about that very point. And we'll wrap up that conversation with Leanne Martin, the regional forester for the Forest Service, to talk about the future of wilderness in the Northern Rockies. Before we get to our guests, I want to point out that we have let neither campaign know what the questions will be tonight, and they will be given each exactly 2 minutes to respond to my questions. I'm kidding. You're actually not watching the presidential debate. You are watching our Fireside Chat with 2 incredible guests, and we're going to talk about bears in and around the Bob. So let me introduce our guests so we can get on with our conversation. Tim Manley is the grizzly bear management specialist for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Born here in Montana in Great Falls, educated at Colorado State University, began working with grizzly bears in the 1980s, including up in the cabinets in the Yak, and has moved on to special work on the South Fork, and is now, again, the grizzly bear management specialist for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Tim, thanks for joining us. I'm glad you're here tonight. And my other guest came into my life in a very interesting way when I took this position with the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation and made my transition to Montana. The very first book I read was this book right here, Down from the Mountain, by our second guest, Bryce Andrews. Bryce has worked as a ranch manager and a land steward for more than a decade. Following his work at the Sun Ranch in the Madison Valley, Montana, he co-founded and managed Oxbow Cattle Company and now owns a ranch here in carnivore country, as he says. He has two great books, Bad Luck Way, which came out in 2014, and Down from the Mountain, the book I just showed you, came out in 2019. And it's the first book I read in my journeys to Montana. And I'm looking forward to visiting with both of you tonight. So thanks for joining us. Tim, I'm going to start with you. I'd love for you to give our guests an overview of what your work looks like as a grizzly bear management specialist for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks.
Okay, Bill. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and hello to everyone. And hi to Bryce. I'm happy to be doing a joint webinar with Bryce. He's got a lot of innovative ideas that I actually kind of watch to see what he's doing to see if I can use some of those in my work. And Bill, welcome up to Montana, and someday maybe we'll get you out on a grizzly bear capture or give you a hands-on experience with it. So
I think the first time you and I met is when you stopped by the ranger station here with with a grizzly bear in a trap. So I need to get a little closer to the action.
Yeah, we're getting into a busy time of the year right now. So what I've done is I've put together a fairly short PowerPoint presentation that I wanted to go through that highlights the work that we do in and around the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. And I do cover a majority of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, all of the Great Bear Wilderness, and a large part of the Bob Marshall. Unfortunately, because of all the work that I have to do in the front country, we don't tend to get into the Bob Marshall very often, but I have made several backcountry trips in there, contacting outfitters and recreations in the Bob. But most of our work actually is outside of the Bob Marshall. And what I wanted to do is give people an overview of that, and then talk specifically towards the end about orphan grizzly bear cub that we actually relocated, and she actually is in the Bob Marshall now, and kind of give people an idea of how we monitor her movements and what she's been doing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and load the PowerPoint. Okay, so like I mentioned, I'm going to cover grizzly bear management, and I cover the northwest portion of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And this is my technician that works with me. Her name is Justine, and she is holding a female cub of the year, not the one I'm going to be talking about, but one that we caught actually in 2018. So this is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, bordered by Canadian border to the north and down to basically Highway 200 and Lincoln on the south, essentially Highway 93 on the west side, and on the east side of the Rocky Mountain front out to Choteau and the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. And you can see the Bob Marshall area is a large part of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, as is Glacier National Park. I don't work in Glacier National Park unless they specifically ask me to come in and help, but we actually did release a female grizzly bear with a cub of the year yesterday in Glacier National Park, because we know that's where she actually dens at. So of that area, this is how much area I cover. This is my area of responsibility, and it's a lot of country, and like I said, unfortunately, I don't get to spend as much time in the backcountry as I'd like to. Just to bring everybody up to speed quickly, grizzly bears are currently listed as threatened species in the lower 48. In 2004, Kate Kendall did a population estimate for the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which included the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and came up with an estimate of 765 grizzly bears. And that was by using DNA, collecting DNA off of rub trees, but also sites that they had put a lure in and put barbed wire around to collect DNA. And then in 2004 to the present time, actually, Rick Mace with Fish, Wildlife and Parks started a population trend monitoring program, and to look at whether the population was going up or down. Rick is retired, and Cecily Costello is now heading up the Trend Project. And it's an interagency project involving the tribes, the park, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And basically, the population seems to be growing about 2.3% annually. And so that brings us up to a current population of around 1,000 grizzly bears in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of overview of some of the work that we do, monitoring the population trends. So when bears are emerging from their dens in the spring, we have a certain number of radio-collared female grizzly bears that we monitor for the trend. And when they first emerge, we'll get up in the helicopter and radio track them. This is actually in the Mission Mountains wilderness, a female grizzly bear denned up there, but we do have some bears that have denned in the Bob Marshall, and it'd be similar situation. And we tried to get visuals on them to see what the cub reproduction is, how many cubs they have, litter size, and how many of those cubs survive throughout the course of the year. And this footage is from Two Bear Air Rescue, and you can see we're actually quite a ways away. They have a good zoom capability on their helicopter. And I have to give kudos to Two Bear Air Rescue. They do have this amazing helicopter with camera on the bottom with infrared and daylight imagery, and can have incredible zoom on it. So we don't have to get that close to the bears. We can stay quite a ways away. And they train their camera operators how to use the camera. And at the same time, we can go in and radio track bears and get visuals on the females with cubs. And I just wanted to give an example of the infrared capabilities. This is a female grizzly with 2 yearlings looking at the infrared, and when it switches over to daylight, you'll see the difference. You can actually see the heat signature in the tracks also. This is what it looks like daylight. So you can see the advantage of having the infrared for actually trying to see and count the number of cubs that are with the female. Another advantage is with the infrared is we can actually get a look inside the dens. This is a grizzly bear den, and you can see on the right-hand side the infrared signature, and you actually can see the female in there, and she has one of her cubs in the den with her. And if we actually blew that up, you'd be able to get even a better look at it. So I'm involved with grizzly bear management. My job is basically to try to reduce conflicts between people and grizzly bears. And it's a very interesting situation because what some people might consider a conflict, other people don't consider it a conflict. Like this fisherman on the lake with a grizzly bear eating fish along the shore of Echo Lake. To some people, this is a conflict. To the fisherman, it probably was no big deal. On the right-hand side, you can see a grizzly bear inside of a trailer, and that bear broke into an empty trailer to get cat food and bread. You can see she has a piece of bread in her mouth. That's definitely a conflict, and that's the type of situation we try to avoid by working with landowners. I deal a lot of our work is dealing with people that are living in bear country. I cover the North Fork, and the Middle Fork of the Flathead, the Swan Valley, and the Flathead Valley, Eureka area, Trigo, and a lot of people living in bear country, specifically grizzly bear country. And so we spend a lot of time working one-on-one with landowners to try to identify and reduce attractants to try to minimize conflicts. And so what we don't want is what you see on the left-hand side, bears getting so comfortable, they're coming in around houses looking for food, and ultimately getting to the point where they have to be trapped or perhaps even either relocated or removed from the population. And of course, that's the last thing we want to do is have to remove a bear from the population. But if the situations warrant it, in consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we make those decisions. So what's our goal? It's basically to minimize conflicts between people and grizzly bears. We want to keep people safe. We want to minimize property damage where we can. And we want to keep bears out of conflict with people. And you can easily see that this bear was getting into hummingbird feeders, which people tend to hang on their porch, and we get calls, why is this bear on my porch? And we usually say, well, do you have bird seed or a hummingbird feeder there? And their response is, well, yeah. And that's usually the explanation for why the bear is hanging around the house. So what are some of the objectives? Well, we're trying to minimize grizzly bear conflict, and that's through working with the landowners to identify and secure attractants. And most people recognize that garbage is a big attractant, but also chickens have become more of an issue in recent years. A lot of people are trying to raise chickens. Fruit trees, this time of the year right now, we're dealing a lot with bears coming down into people's orchards, gardens, etc. And then chickens in the lower right-hand corner. And I'll talk a little more about the chickens. Of course, we don't have the chickens in the Bob Marshall, but some of the bears that do use the Bob Marshall come out of the Bob do encounter residences where they do capture and kill chickens. And so we work a lot with landowners on trying to prevent that from occurring. Electric fence is a great tool to use. This is a temporary electric fence. And I'll talk a little bit more about the application of electric fences in backcountry wilderness situation, perhaps more around outfitter camps. I have a picture where we did put a electric fence around outfitter camp in the Bob. And a lot of people say, well, is electric fencing effective? Does it work? Well, this young grizzly bear had gotten into this chicken coop, and you can see that they store the grain right there on that side, the chicken feed. So what I did is I just took some field fence, stapled it to the door, hooked a hot wire to an energizer, put a ground pad underneath. Bear touches it, gets shocked, takes off. Those residents have kept that camera. This is 2014. They still have cameras up on the chicken coop, and they haven't had any other issues since then. So it can be very effective. And it also keeps other predators from getting into chickens: black bears, fox, skunks, raccoons. Seems everything likes to eat chickens. And electric fence is a good tool to use to keep your livestock protected from these different animals. So does it work? Here's an electrified screen that we put over a chicken coop. We just stapled the screen to the window the bear had gone into. And you can be pretty creative. This is a metal door that had horse feed in it and cat food. And this female grizzly with 2 yearlings had recently pushed this door open, so we electrified the door. And you can see she just touched it with her nose and took off. So again, you know, trying to be creative in terms of how you can deter bears from getting into stuff that they'd previously gotten into. And here's another example. This is a mat that we did many years ago. This grizzly had gotten into this chest freezer in a carport. We put down a rubber mat. We put a cattle panel on top of it, electrified it. So when she stepped on it, she gets shocked and takes off. One of the things that we deal a lot with in the valley especially is the illegal feeding of wildlife. And in Montana, it is illegal to knowingly feed and attract deer, elk, moose, grizzly bears, black bears, and mountain lions. And so putting feed blocks out, putting grain out for those animals, it is illegal to do that. And people can be cited for that. And people wonder, well, why is that an issue? And really, if you think about it, these bears, when they maybe leave the valley and they're used to feeding on grain, well, what happens when they get into the wilderness area? And the outfitters or the horsemen back there have grain in their camps. Bears seek that out, and that can cause issues with that. We do a lot of educational work. Started actually with Swan Valley Ecosystem Center, Swan Valley Bear Resources down the Swan, where they actually do bear fairs, and we've expanded those into areas like Pole Bridge and Middle Fork up at Essex, and we're planning to do, you know, whitefish and other areas in the near future. But it's a chance to get together with landowners. And then we've been working on trying to work with Grizzly Wolf Discovery Center and Living with Wildlife Foundation, and coming up with effective bear-resistant garbage containers that can be tested down at the Grizzly Wolf Discovery Center. This is the Kodiak can that actually was tested and passed down there, and we're recommending that landowners can use this. This is actually a wild bear testing the can. I put in a leg of a roadkill deer over on the east side of the Flathead Valley just to see if the bear could get into it, a wild bear. and it was very effective. Bear didn't get into it. And I know that the Forest Service has taken some of these bear-resistant containers and put them into their backcountry barns where they have horse feed stored. So if a bear does get into a barn, they can't get into the horse feed in those locations. This bear just rolled it off into the woods, never did get into it. I just had to go and retrieve it. Big part of the job is to work with the agencies like the Forest Service to promote food storage on public lands and to minimize grizzly bear conflicts. And in the lower right, that is an outfitter camp in the Bob Marshall. It's a cook tent and a sleeping tent. And they were having bear issues at that site. And so we went in and erected a temporary electric fence around it, used a portable solar panel charger energizer to electrify the fence and circled the whole place and left it up until they ended up pulling out of camp. And so it's not difficult to erect or maintain, and it's can be very effective in keeping bears out of camps in the backcountry. And the food storage boxes in the front country, Forest Service is starting to put more of those in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And of course, we try to get the Forest Service personnel involved with helping us work and handle bears. And I know Bryce wants to talk about some things they've been doing with food hanging poles. And I think that's a very important topic to talk about tonight is food storage and options in the backcountry. I also work with city, county, state, federal agencies in the front country. So I work with Flathead County, Lake, Lincoln, and Missoula County. And all these sites on the left, if they're green, they've been protected. They're garbage transfer stations with electric fencing. And the ones in yellow are partway there, and the ones in red don't have anything. They just have chain link around it, but we're working on getting those made bear resistant or bear proof. And it's been very effective on protecting the transfer stations from bears getting into them. So it's basically a chain link fence to keep the garbage from blowing around outside with electrified fence all the way around it. And then another objective is to provide information on the media, to the media on how to people can, minimize grizzly bear conflicts. And so we do a lot of TV interviews, media shows, that kind of stuff, newspaper, press releases to try to get the word out. And then the big one is to respond to grizzly bear conflicts on private and public lands in a timely manner. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, this is not in the wilderness, but this was on Forest Service land down the Swan. This was a young hunter that harvested his first deer, hung it from a meat pole that was there at Forest Service site that somebody had put up, private individual, obviously not high enough, and the grizzly bear came in and shredded the deer. And so again, I think it'd be a good topic of conversation about food storage, game storage in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. Just a collage of some of the conflicts that we deal with: bears getting in garbage, turkeys ripped into a yurt up at Pole Bridge, chicken feed, that kind of stuff, checking out cars. So a wide range of conflicts that we tend to deal with. Just some more bears in yards, livestock, a little bit of livestock depredation on my side. It's mostly been sheep or goats or pigs, but not a lot. Mostly chickens is what I tend to deal with. And the bottom picture is that female grizzly I showed you before she got shot with the door. She had pushing on it. You can see how much time she spent. And all she was doing was teaching her yearlings how to break into stuff. And like I said, we electrified the door after this, and you saw a reaction earlier. And right now we're dealing with fruit trees, a lot of fruit. We have a fruit cleaning, Flathead fruit cleaning page where we try to connect people that have fruit trees with people that want fruit picked. And there's a lot of bears right now in the valley going after fruit. So to give you an idea of what I deal with, I began in this position in 1993, and to the present have over 470 captures of over 280 grizzly bears individuals. We average about 17 captures a year for management. And these are bears that get in some level of conflict or preventative measures that may get into conflicts. And like I said, we average about 17 captures a year. this year, 2020, we're up to 18 captures to date for management. So I wanted to talk just about the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, because that's why people are here. Of the, everybody says we're dumping all the bears into the Bob. Of the 478 captures, I've only released one grizzly bear inside the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and that was in 1997 at Schaefer Meadows, where we flew in and we actually darted a subadult male grizzly bear at Schaefer Meadows. I was hanging around the buildings there. We radio collared him there, put him in the airplane, taxied down the runway, and let him recover on the far end of the runway. Unfortunately, that bear started visiting outfitter camps where meat was not secured properly, and we ended up having to actually go in and remove that young male grizzly bear lethally because of that. But I have released grizzly bears near the Great Bear and Bob Marshall Wilderness boundaries, primarily up Unawa Creek or Spotted Bear River, those areas. And we've had some of those bears go into the Bob, but of those bears that went into the wilderness, not many of them stayed there. They like to try to get back home. And like I said, I have released a number of them, of course, right on the border of the wilderness areas. And one of the things that may be a topic of discussion is we used to have designated release sites in the Bob Marshall that would be accessible by helicopter, but because of the concerns of helicopter use in the Bob, I've not taken advantage of that and actually have said I don't need the expense and we don't really need to helicopter bears into the Bob. But I know Jamie Jonkel down on Missoula, my counterpart, would like to bring that up into discussion at the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem Subcommittee meeting this winter as an option again, because he has very limited places that he can relocate bears to. They usually come up into our area in Region 1, and because we have more land area that we can release bears, but he would like to talk about that. But there are a lot of issues relative to helicopter use in the Bob Marshall, as most of you know. And what I wanted to do now was talk specifically about an orphan female cub of the year that we captured in 2019. Actually, we caught her in Ferndale. You can see in the lower left-hand corner. That was her capture site. She and her mother were getting into chickens, killing chickens. We had moved both of them. They returned, and we recaptured both of them. And we ended up removing the adult female. We ended up killing her, which ended up with the cub being orphaned. And so we did capture the cub. She was 102 pounds. We put a GPS radio collar on her, and our options were either release her back into the wild or send her to a zoo or kill her. Well, I thought, let's give her a chance. Let's see if she'll make it. She's in good shape. It's in the fall. And so we put a GPS radio collar on her, and we released her in Deep Creek, which is on the east side of Hungry Horse Reservoir, just outside the boundaries of the Great Bear Wilderness. And basically, the release went well. She's a little aggressive. This is a cub of the year. This is releasing her in Deep Creek. We figured she has an attitude. She'll probably do just fine. And she actually denned in the upper left-hand corner up near Desert Mountain. And so she went from the release site and traveled on her own up towards Desert Mountain. She actually dug a den and denned up for the winter successfully. And then she came out, and you can see all those dots up there. Those are her GPS radio locations for this spring, last fall and this spring. And the problem was she was hanging between Coram and Martin City on the mule pasture. And our concern was that eventually she was going to go into Martin City or Coram, where there's a lot of unsecured attractants, garbage, dog food, bird feeders, you name it. So we actually ended up going in and recapturing her right next to the mule pasture on private land. Here she is after we recaptured her. Plus, I wanted to check her radio collar because, collaring a cub of the year, you want to make sure the collar's not too tight. So we actually drugged her, checked the radio collar. It was fitting fine. We have the ability to actually drop the collar remotely. And so I'm going to do that after she comes out of the den this next spring. And we decided to move her down to Spotted Bear River. So we took her from Coram area and released her down at the end of Spotted Bear River Road. You can see the release site down the lower right. And here's her release. And then we started monitoring with the GPS collar. And basically, you can see all the blue dots in the lower right-hand side. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about some of the locations she was at. But it appears that she's denning right about now, high elevation between Spotted Bear River and Schaefer, the middle fork of the Flathead, and up high. And so it looks like she's hopefully successfully going to den this winter. But I wanted to blow up some of her locations a little bit. You can see where we released her at. She basically moved north, and there's basically a series of dots right here. She spent time there, and then she left, and she went over into the Strawberry Creek area and Gooseberry, and she spent basically most of the summer in the burn up here, probably eating huckleberries. And then after the huckleberries dropped off, after the hard frost, she moved back over towards where we released her, and she actually is spending time right here, and that's where we think she's going to end up denning. So it'll be interesting to see how she does. But I consider that a success story, especially if she survives okay and actually ends up reproducing. Of course, I'm going to drop her radio collar after she comes out of the den this spring, because I don't want the collar to get too tight on her. So with that, a lot of people, when you handle big bears, heavy bears, you got to get several people together to get them back in the culvert trap. And I have several people that help me with that, and I sure appreciate their help. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. And like I said, I look forward to the questions and having conversations. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. I already have a question, which is what makes that cub the cub of the year? Was that a certain designation, or is that just what you're calling her?
She was, when we caught her, she was born that year. So we call a cub of the year a cub that is born in 2019. She was a cub of the year. This year, she's actually a yearling. Yep.
So in other words, she's not the cub of the year, but she is a cub of the year of 2019. I got you.
Correct.
Well, we'll have you stop sharing your screen, but I have a couple questions that I want to sort of pursue. And I also want to tell folks who are enjoying tonight's presentation, there is a box at the bottom. If you move your mouse, it says Q&A. If you have any questions for us tonight, I'll be monitoring that Q&A box, and be sure to put your questions in there and I'll share those. Tim, just to sort of follow up with your presentation, what role does a place as big as the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex play? What kind of role does that complex play in that effort of, the growth to we now have you said a population of about 1,000 in the Continental Divide ecosystem. And you have an idea of how many of that 1,000 make their home in the Bob?
Well, I don't have, any specific numbers for that because bears cover so much country moving in and out of the Bob Marshall, same thing with Glacier Park. What's interesting is when Kate Kendall did her project in 2004 and they had sites in the Bob, they didn't get as many hits and detections in the Bob Marshall as everybody expected. Everybody thought, oh, the Bob Marshall is full of grizzly bears. And we're not sure why it doesn't have the numbers that people would have expected. I know that when there was a grizzly bear hunting season, most of the grizzlies that were harvested during the hunting season were harvested within the Bob Marshall Wilderness because of the early rifle season for elk. And, whether that had any influence, we don't know. We don't know if it's habitat related. It's much higher than the surrounding areas. And so, the bears that are there have a shorter season, I guess you could say. They have to come out of their dens later and they have to go into their dens earlier. Habitat is definitely different. It dries out in parts of the Bob Marshall. It's not, as lush in some places, doesn't have the avalanche chute complex. And then we've been trying to, the Trend Project has actually been trying to capture some grizzly bears females in the Bob Marshall and have not had the success that they were hoping. And we don't know why that is. They've caught some males, and some of those males, move out of the Bob Marshall. And they've had a couple of females that actually have stayed in the Bob Marshall that they've caught, that they actually captured in there. But it's been very difficult, actually. It's a difficult place to trap. For one thing, you have to work off horses. But it's interesting because when you talk to people that spend time in the Bob, they don't see a lot of bears in the Bob, a lot of grizzly bears. They're there, obviously. Whether they're more avoiding of people, we don't know that for sure. I know the Trend Project has put some trail cameras in there to try to look at grizzly bear use in the Bob Marshall, documenting females with cubs. And it's pretty tough to get pictures of grizzly bears in the Bob at times. And why that is, we don't know. But so it's hard to say what percentage of the population, is in the Bob, because it's really hard to get some of those figures and some of those numbers. But I think, it's a good undisturbed area for the most part. There's a lot of secure habitat in the Bob Marshall. There's some excellent grizzly bear habitat in there. But again, it's hard to get access to some of it for some of the work in terms of trend monitoring.
What are the different habitat needs? What's the difference in the habitat needs between the black bear and the grizzly bear?
Well, they have a lot of similar habitat needs. Grizzly bears tend to use more open areas. They do a lot more digging than black bears. Black bears aren't big diggers. But, the main food in Northwest Montana for both species are the huckleberries, the berry crops, and both species use those berry crops in similar ways. Grizzly bears just are more adept at digging, and so they eat more roots and corms, dig more ground squirrels, that type of thing, than the black bears do. But overall, there's quite a bit of overlap in their diets.
We're getting a lot of great questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in a minute, everybody. I promise we'll get to those questions. One question I want to ask of you, Tim, real quick, is our community likes to spend time in the Bob, both on foot and on horseback. What do they need to think about as they go into the backcountry in grizzly and black bear country?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I tell people is just be respectful of the animal, for one thing. Realize you are in grizzly and black bear country. Keep clean camps. Don't let food lay out around where bears can get to it. They're very good at finding stuff. That's why there are food storage orders in place to have people comply with. That is very important. I carry bear spray, and I recommend that people that are recreating carry bear spray, know how to use it. Some people prefer to carry guns, but I've been in a lot of situations where people have shot at bears with guns and have injured bears severely, and we never could find the bear. And I know people have used bear spray very effectively on bears. And in fact, that's why I carry it. Never had to use it, but I carry it all the time. And we recommend that people do carry it and know how to use it. And again, just be aware of it, of your surroundings when you're in the backcountry. If you're in the huckleberry fields during huckleberry time, or you see bear scat on the trail or bear scat around your camp, just be aware that, the bears are there. And when bears tend to come in around camps, it's usually at night. They use cover of darkness to move around. And the big attractants can be grain for the people that are taking livestock into the backcountry. Make sure that you're storing your grain properly so bears can't get to it. And then if you do get a lot of hunters in the backcountry, if you do get a elk down, get the meat away from the gut pile as soon as you can. Leave it out in an area, pack it out as soon as you can. But if you can't get it out to the field right away, at least leave it in an area where you can see it from a distance and know whether a bear has claimed it or not. And, we recommend don't challenge a bear. If it's claimed your elk, you've lost your elk. Don't go in there and try to push them off, because you could put yourself in a bad situation. And we've had bears killed because people tried to take their elk back, and the bears became defensive, and people shot and killed the bear because of it. So.
Well, that leads us right into a video that I want to share with you all, because we have, of course, primary rifle season opening up this weekend. I'm going to share this video real quick, and then I want to bring Bryce into the conversation.
Wherever people and grizzlies share wild country, it's important to make sure we keep bears from getting unnatural foods. If bears start coming around camps, campgrounds, and figuring out that's a place to get an easy meal, they're going to keep coming back. They're not going to act like wild bears anymore. They're going to be really bold. So we want to prevent those bears from having to be removed or from destroying property or harming people. So when people go out into the woods, into backcountry settings, you know, we're modern human beings. We like to take a lot of stuff with us. A lot of food to eat, and if it's during hunting season and you're successful, you're going to have a lot of fresh meat that you need to store someplace as well. One of the best things to do with that game meat is to get it high off the ground where a bear can't get to it. And what we found is that carcass poles are about the best way to do that. Scott and I built over 200 of these structures now over the last 14 years in places where grizzlies were starting to move back into after being absent for many, many decades. We identify areas that get a lot of use, that people repeatedly come back to camp in, and they're close to places where they're going to be able to hunt elk or other big game animals. We like to have a couple of good live trees as the uprights, somewhere 15 to 20 odd feet apart from each other. That gives us a good wide span for hanging stuff. And then we cut down a tree to use as the pole. It's going to be the horizontal piece of the structure that you throw the rope over and hoist loads up on.
Steve usually does most of the chainsaw work and peels the log. While he's doing that, I work my way up the tree to limit as I go. We use climbing gear in order to be able to attach ourselves to the tree. That allows us to move around up there and to be able to use both hands freely. So we get the log peeled, moved into place, and have attached our 4-to-1 pulling system. The pole is then lifted to our marks that we shot with the laser level. These logs can weigh 350. I would guess that this one has got to weigh well over 400 pounds. This particular pole has an 18-foot span. Your food or a carcass has to be hung 4 feet from any vertical structure so that a bear cannot climb the tree and reach out and grab it. That's mitigated more problems than anything. Save more bears and more people.
We take 15 feet of grade 70 chain up the tree with us. That's got way more strength than what we actually need for the structure, and attach the horizontal piece to the uprights with that chain.
Strength of the chain is 3,200 pounds. And then it's wrapped at least twice completely around. This is built to be able to hang a lot of weight on.
It's a pretty exciting time to be working in grizzly bear conservation. You look around the world and large mammals are really in decline. Yet here in a very populated, industrialized nation like the United States, we've actually got this Pleistocene carnivore, the grizzly bear, that is growing in population. You know, if we can do our part to put the tools on the landscape here so that folks can make the right choices and not create conflicts with bears, they can live in a lot more places and thrive and be truly wild animals.
Well, a great example of important work being done, including by the organization that Bryce works with, People and Carnivores works for. But Bryce, I want to come back to your book. Like I said, as I made transition from living in only black bear country in the mountains of North Carolina to moving out here to grizzly and black bear country, it was really fun and informative to read this book. What brought you to write Down from the Mountain, the life and death of a grizzly bear?
Well, I guess as is probably evident by this time, I have a life of pieces. So I'm a writer, but I also I'm the field director for People and Carnivores, the nonprofit group that created that video. And I actually have carried on the work that's going on in that video. So I've spent quite a bit of time this summer putting up bear poles, food storage structures just south of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex down here in the Blackfoot Valley, and then farther south in Phillipsburg. So so I have this life of pieces, right? I work for this conservation group. I write, and my wife and I have a farm down here in the Jocko Valley. And it was my work with People and Carnivores that opened on to the story that's in Down from the Mountain. Because when I hired on with that group, I was actually tasked with expanding their work, which had been going on for a while down in the valleys around Yellowstone, expanding it into this part of the world. And what that led to is that I ended up coming up here to the Flathead Reservation, which is where we now live, and starting a conversation with the Natural Resources Department of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And if you don't know anything about the way the tribes have worked to conserve and restore grizzly populations, it's a fascinating story because they made some choices, and maybe you'll talk about this a little next week as well, but they made some choices that really allowed grizzly bears to thrive in this area, including setting aside a portion of the Mission Mountains tribal wilderness, and basically saying, people can't go into that chunk during this time of year. So they actually excluded people from a significant chunk of their reservation for the specific purpose of essentially giving the grizzly bears the time and the space that they needed to be wild and to reproduce. So I came here, started this conversation, and one of the first questions that I had for Stacy Corville, who's the bear biologist for the tribes here, was, I'm working for this nonprofit group, and our mission is to reconnect and restore native carnivore populations by reducing conflict. I said, what are the big sources of conflict? And one of the things that Stacy said to me immediately, he said, oh, think about corn and chickens. And neither of those were what I expected, right? I had been a ranch manager for about a decade before taking this job with People and Carnivores. And I was thinking we'd be talking about, sheep ranchers, or, that we'd be talking about the need to get livestock guardian dogs out with big flocks. But the truth was that bears were coming into conflict with farmers in the valley and the people who owned smaller parcels of land and kept small livestock. And one of the first large projects I got involved with was to try to keep grizzly bears out of a cornfield that was right along the edge of the Mission Mountain range. And so a ton of bears had been habituated and food conditioned to return to this to return to this field every fall. They were coming in and they were feeding in this cornfield, about a 90-acre cornfield, and feeding there, consuming about a fifth of the crop. So the corn farmer was losing a ton of money. The bears were being drawn out of the high country where they otherwise would have been feeding on wild food sources. And you had this kind of recipe for disaster where bears were being kept close to the developed farmed landscape in their hungriest season. So I spent, a number of summers working on this project, but the book is about the first one in which I built this fence to try to keep, at certain times they had documented up to 16 grizzlies feeding in this cornfield at the same time. So I was building this fence, which was this little, completely unexceptional looking thing. It's a knee-high 3-wire electric fence that had proved effective and promising in a series of small-scale tests. But this was the first time it had been tried at this scale and with, a food attractant of this level. So I was building this fence, and that project is what allowed me to connect with a bear who's at the center of this story, which was a sow named Millie. And the work that I was doing in the field caused me to cross paths with this bear. It was just a fascinating animal with a truly gripping, but also somewhat tragic story.
And you tell it incredibly in the book. Interesting having read the book and then seeing both you and Tim and some of his Fish, Wildlife, and Parks colleagues on the 60-minute segment a couple of weeks ago. The thought of a 90-acre cornfield with 16 grizzly bears in it is, I don't know if terrifying is the right word, but it certainly creates gripping and compelling thoughts. I remember specifically in the book, the farmer talking about never going in that field if he wasn't inside his truck or his vehicle. I think it wasn't a truck, but he couldn't go inside his own cornfield because you didn't, obviously in a cornfield, you don't know what's 10 feet from you.
Right.
Be also interesting for you doing that work, getting that fence up and wondering, did one get in? That was another interesting part of the book.
Well, and I think terrifying is the right word. I mean, it's, and I have been in that cornfield when there are grizzly bears in it, and it's kind of a bizarre experience, because you, on the one hand, have corn, which is sort of like a national symbol of, Arcadia and safe Midwestern farming.
It's the ultimate form of domestication, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's this sort of sea of food. But you also you're surrounded by the evidence of these bears in here. So going through the cornfield, when I did have to do that, I would be going from, through these sort of rooms that the bears would open up, because the way they feed is actually really fascinating. And that's part of what's so engaging about bears, is they do a lot of things the same way we do. Like that, the way that they would feed on that corn is they would pick an ear, they would husk it, and then they would eat the kernels off of it, just like a human being would do, at a Sunday barbecue.
Just no butter and salt, though.
Not that we were able to document, verify. No. But no, so it's an interesting thing, but it's also, what I think is interesting about this story and why it's relevant to what we're talking about tonight in the Bob is that, so this is a story about one particular place. It's about this cornfield. It's about a single bear. But when you look at any story like that, and you look at any individual grizzly like that, what you realize is that these are animals that use the entire landscape, right? They stitch this. We have like a patchwork quilt of a landscape now in Western Montana. We have these blocks of important, essential wilderness land that remain ecologically intact for the most part, like the Bob. And then we have these valley floors that are just a complete mix of development and agricultural land and preserved land. And the bears, one of the things that always blows my mind when you see the telemetry from them, they're stitching this whole landscape together. So a bear might spend, a month in the most remote reaches of the Mission Range, places that see 1 or 2 human visitors in a year. And they might spend the very next month, crossing Highway 93 twice a night to go and feed in somebody's melon patch, or, go and move through to the habitat in the lowlands. So I think it's a fascinating thing to think about as the character of our landscape changes, as more and more people come here, and as we continue to develop and build up these lower areas in the landscape. We have to think about, what does this mean for the bears that call both those places and places like the Bob home? And what kind of agency do we have in terms of making sure that the future is one that will work for us and for them?
Yeah, it's incredibly important work and fascinating work. You use the word, they stitch together sort of this mosaic of places. Someday we're going to stitch together 2 different populations, right? Because the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem population is unique and distinct from the Greater Yellowstone population, right? And they're getting incredibly close to maybe connecting, correct? Or has that happened yet?
They're getting very close to it, and the dispersers from the populations are getting into areas like the Big Hole Valley, appearing in the Bitterroot, crossing Interstate 90. We're at this really, I think, fascinating moment for the story of grizzlies in the modern West, where there is a chance of these populations coming together in a meaningful reproductive way. And seeing that kind of interchange between the populations is like, really, for me, one of the things that gives me a lot of hope in terms of our potential to conserve what so many of us value and care about in this landscape. A thing that's important to understand about the grizzlies is that their historic range extended, all the way south through California, all the way east to the Great Plains, all the way west to the coast. So what they're living in are these just little shreds of this enormous landscape that historically they understood how to survive in. And I think that, I say we're at this crucial moment, and I think that's because we've seen something really strange happen, right? Because for most of the last couple hundred years in the West, you could accurately describe this landscape as a sea of wilderness with islands of domesticated land and islands of human inhabitation in it. But we've just, I think, in the last few decades here, we've passed the point where the reverse of that becomes true, where the wildernesses are now our islands and we are the ocean surrounding those islands. And what we have to do is give these animals safe passage between those those places that are ecologically intact enough to sustain them, if we want them to remain viable and present across this landscape.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting tonight to have Tim from a state agency working on both public and private lands. Your work primarily on private lands, but also public lands with like the food storage systems you're putting in, that sort of thing. That it's going to take that mosaic, to go back to another word you used, of public and private land conservation. Here in Montana, we're spoiled in that we have 1.5 million acres of the Bob, surrounded by roughly another 1 million acres of pretty primitive land, also adjoining the missions and adjoining the 1 million acre Glacier National Park. But the valleys, I think it's really important at this time, are really filling up. I think we're all watching it happen almost before our eyes, because COVID is changing. It seemed like migration patterns for humans pretty rapidly. And the conflicts are going to be incredibly complex to mitigate, it feels like. And Tim, Bryce, either one of you guys jump in there, but it feels like it's going to get more complex, even though the opportunities, like the connecting the two populations, are going to be greater too.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're going to have to think about this a little bit differently, and we're going to have to attend a little bit more to bears than we have. Because one of the things that I'm struck with whenever I get the chance, which I really appreciate, to work with people like Tim or Jamie Jonkel or Stacy Corville, the people who are actually responding to every one of these conflicts, you realize like how many of these things are avoidable. There's a massive percentage of these conflicts, a few small steps, putting electric fence, securing your garbage, like these things that are, they're not like sleek, sexy ideas, but they're really important. And if we do these things, we can improve survivability for grizzlies in these crucial corridors and throughout the ecosystem. And that's, I mean, to some degree, this is a numbers game. This is about, when bears strike off south and west from the corner of the NCDE, when they head into this landscape where we don't see a lot of grizzly bears because they were extirpated, where they're exterminated from that landscape in the, in the last century. Like what are their statistics of making it through or making it to a place where they can den, and everything we can do to make it so that they don't have to keep rolling a loaded dice, every time they pass a chicken coop, every time they pass a dumpster. I mean, that stuff is huge. And that's the only way that more people and more bears can share this landscape, is if we take care of some of those simple things that are present across this place that we share.
Tim, you want to build on that?
Well, I think, Bryce hit it pretty succinctly. A lot of the things you can do to avoid conflicts are actually pretty easy. The problem is we're asking people to change their lifestyle a little bit. And for some people, change is hard. And to give you an example, today I've had 6 calls on grizzly bears in and around way from basically Trigo down to Swan Lake area in the Swan Valley. And it ranged from bears getting into garbage, bears getting in killing chickens, bears in the backyard, just walking through the backyard. And, I think we've seen a lot more tolerance in places where we spent time working with people. Like, Bryce mentioned down on the Flathead Reservation, Stacy Corville and with Bryce working down there, Swan Valley Bear Resources, Swan Ecosystem Connections working in the Swan Valley has helped a lot. And, a lot of the work that we've done in the other areas, you got to have people be willing to coexist with these animals. And coexistence has to extend beyond the ecosystem where we're at, between the ecosystems. And we're seeing bears that are moving into the Salish range, which is west of, the NCDE between the Cabinet Yaak. And, a bear that goes out in that area, it's outside their grizzly bear recovery area. And people they're used to black bears, but not grizzly bears. And they're not used to having grizzly bears show up. And so their first concern is human safety, which I can understand. But, they're like, well, we don't care if the black bears are around. We're not worried about them. They get in our garbage once in a while, or they, get into, our fruit trees, but no big deal. But, oh, we don't want a grizzly bear doing that. And, it's just a matter of people realizing that those bears are out there. They can do things to keep bears from coming in around their homes and getting into conflict.
I'm going to go to some of the questions now, and folks, keep in your questions in the Q&A box. So from Ann, this question, I'm going to sort of combine these two, from Ann and from Mike. Ann's question is, do grizzlies leave the bob because the population niches in the wilderness are mostly full? And Mike's question is, any idea of the bear carrying capacity of the bob?
Well, carrying capacity, for one thing, is a difficult thing to measure. Bears have such a wide range in their diets. They're very adaptable. I think they're a lot more adaptable than we gave them credit for. When I started working on grizzly bears, you always heard, oh, grizzly bears need this vast wild area to live in. And they're all in the Bob Marshall, and people are surprised if they show up in the valley. But as Bryce said, bear may stay a month in the Mission Mountains and a month down in amongst people crossing Highway 93. They are very adaptable. And so it's hard to measure carrying capacity because bears have home ranges that are huge. We have adult males that have 800 square mile home ranges, and it's nothing for them to cover the entirety of Glacier Park or, much of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And they don't exclude other bears from their territories. A lot of people think, oh, bears are territorial. How can you have more bears on top of each other? They really don't exclude other bears from their territories. The territories overlap, home ranges overlap. That's a better word for it. So in terms of carrying capacity, it's really hard to say. And the other question that Ann had was, in terms of why are bears moving out, is because of, there's the Bob Marshall is full of bears, that type of thing.
Yeah, are the niches full?
Yeah, from our work that we've done in the Bob Marshall, I wouldn't say the Bob Marshall is full. It could be that some of those bears that come out of the Bob Marshall are just looking for different food sources, especially on the Rocky Mountain front. They go out onto the river bottoms in the springtime, and some of those bears have learned that food sources are out there, during the entire season that bears are out there, all the way into the fall. And so, why go back into the Bob Marshall if they're finding food resources out on the prairie? I think you're still muted, Bill.
Thanks for catching that, Tim.
Sure.
Also from Ann, and this for you, Bryce, does People and Carnivores work with Vital Ground in Missoula and Yellowstone and the Yukon, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative?
We do work with Vital Ground. In fact, they're kind enough to fund some of our work. And the work that we do is definitely part of the Y2Y effort. This kind of connectivity work, the sort of thing that I was just describing there at the south end of the NCDE, it's very much a part of that work. So, I think that's what's kind of cool about this, is there's a whole community of people, from agencies, from nonprofits, landowners who are conservation minded and care about wildlife. There's a whole network of people who are looking for better ways to share this landscape and to make their living from the landscape without, harming the native wildlife. So yeah, we definitely do work with those entities, and it's a big community of people who work on this kind of stuff, and it needs to be, because there's a whole lot of landscape to cover. Like when I look at, whenever I look at Tim's territory or Jamie's territory, or you think about that and you think how few people there are for such a massive and rugged piece of land, and you realize, like as a society, you know, we actually, I mean, despite all of the efforts from all of us who work on it, we collectively haven't thrown that many resources at it, and we could throw more at it. And I think that we'll need to in the coming time.
Yeah, there's another question here that is, you know, what are the chances of the agencies, or I'm going to add, you know, local governments, to approach land use regulation as a means to reduce conflict, in the same sort of ways that we have to think about what to do in the WUI when it comes to human living in, you know, the wildland urban interface and fire.
Well,
is it going to be the combination of public and private versus, you know, regulation that's going to get us there?
I know Tim will probably have something to say about this too, but I just want to jump in and say that there are some really powerful tools out there. Like, so our farm is just at the very northern edge of this part of Missoula County. So we're in Missoula County, and Missoula County has what's called an open space bond. And that means that everybody in the county, when it came time to vote on taxes, we shelled out and set aside a pool of money, which is specifically for protecting open space and protecting the kind of habitat that bears need to have to move from one place to another. I don't know whether, I know Lake County doesn't have one of those. I'm not sure about Flathead County, but that's a heck of a tool to do the private land component of this. And I sit on the county open lands board, which is a board of citizens that makes recommendations to the county on how to use that money. And that, I think, is something that every county in Montana should do, you know, yesterday, because the cost to each citizen is very small, and the impact can be amazing. Because what you can do, if just in case our audience is not, you know, fully like up to date, which I wasn't when I started this, on the concept of easements, they're voluntary restrictions that landowners can place on a deed. So like on our farm is under easement, and what we pledged to do is to let there be never more than 3 homes on a chunk of 160 acres. And we've also said that we'll do certain things in terms of, you know, maintaining habitat and keeping the place in agriculture. And what that means is that in perpetuity, or at least as long as the deed for this property exists, those restrictions will be on it. And the landowner chooses that. It's not a regulation. The landowner chooses it, and they're paid for it when there's an open space bond. So I cannot speak highly enough of that as a tool. And I think it's something worth considering and pushing for any county in Montana that's serious about maintaining the wild ecological integrity of its land.
Tim?
Well, in terms of, I think that's great. Missoula County is doing that. Flathead County is not. Lake County is not. I don't believe Lincoln County is either. In terms of regulation, you know, we've got some things on the books in terms of food storage orders, you know, that are in place. That was a battle to get those into place, and there's maybe some more work that needs to be done on tightening those up. But there's the food storage orders, and then there's, you know, the enforcement of that to be considered. One thing that's kind of unique is the city of Whitefish has ordinance that you can't roll out your garbage till morning of pickup within city limits. And we've been working with the city. It's been in place for several years, quite a while. The problem is that people don't have a way to store their garbage, you know, in a garage. They don't have a garage or something. And they can use bear resistant garbage containers like the Kodiak cans, but the hauling company is looking for the city basically to buy the cans for them. It's a big expenditure. And so you've got a regulation and ordinance in place that says you can't leave your garbage out unless it's in a bear resistant container, but you can roll it out, you know, morning to pickup if it's not. And you just go through Whitefish and there's all these garbage cans sitting around the bears are getting into because it's not being enforced, for one thing, and people just don't have a way to comply. And so I think with any time regulations are put into place, you need to look at the ability for people to comply with those regulations. And so, you know, kind of like the open space thing we talked about with Missoula, and Whitefish has the resort tax, right? Well, they can use it for developing planting trees and redoing sidewalks, but they can't buy bear resistant garbage cans for the city of Whitefish. And so we're hoping in 2021, when they revisit that we can get that included. And so, there are regulations like that are citywide. We don't have any countywide regulations in terms of proper garbage storage or anything like that. And in terms of zoning, Flathead County politically right now is not, open to a lot of that. There's a lot of people who like to see that, but there's also, commissioners and other people that are involved with that, private property rights are a big issue. So, it's kind of a difficult thing to deal with. And I would love to see something countywide that says you have to store your garbage in a bear resistant manner. You can be fined by Fish, Wildlife and Parks if bears get into your attractants, but you have to be warned first that, you can't do that before a fine can be levied. And when fines have been levied, what we've seen is $125, and so it's not a very big deterrent for some of that.
Well, Bryce, you talked about these programs being voluntary. That's one of the best things we can do to, move away from the spectrum of regulation or not regulation, but actually people coming in and doing these things in terms of thinking about living in bear country and taking the logical steps to, not have bird feeders on your porch, not have hummingbird feeders on your porch, that sort of thing. That's something we all can do that doesn't require, regulation. I'm kind of curious, Tim, do you have a favorite story from inside the Bob with bears? I mean, obviously, I love the way you wrapped up your presentation with what at this point, at least looks like a success story, that the second relocation of that cub of the year from 2019, making home up in the mountains above Schaefer. But you have a favorite story you'd like to share from in the Bob with the bears?
Well, I mentioned it about the bear at Schaefer, and that was in '97. And I'll just very briefly recap that. But that was a young male. We went in, we free range darted. Dave Horner flew us into the landing strip at Schaefer, darted the bear, put a radio collar on him, put him in the plane, taxied down the runway to get him away from the buildings, put him out on the ground. He recovered. We monitored that bear. And then when hunting season started, we got a call that there was a grizzly bear trying to get into somebody's camp. And it was just a regular hunter. It was not an outfitter's camp at that time. And so I flew in with actually Kerry Hunt with Wind River Bear Institute. And we took in a couple of curling bear dogs with us. And we hiked into this guy's camp and not far from Schaefer. And he was just quite concerned that this grizzly bear kept trying to come into his camp. And so we actually spent the night in the tent with him, with the dogs, and pushed that bear out many times during the night because that bear was consistently trying to come in to the camp to get food because it had gotten food rewards at other places and it knew that there was food at camps. Long story short, that bear ended up to go into an outfitter's camp. We called for additional people to come in. Eric Wenham flew in with his curling bear dog and a person that worked for Wind River Bear Institute. They flew in to Schaefer and we hiked in to the outfitter camp. And basically we told the outfitters, oh, there's grizzly bear that's been visiting camps. And they're like, oh yeah, we know it's been around our camp. Well, has it been getting any food rewards? And they're like, well, no, it hadn't gotten into anything. Well, the next day they came to us and said, bear came in and took one of our elk quarters that we left laying on the ground. We didn't hang it on the meat pole. We got in, we were tired. We didn't want to hang it. So we just left it on the ground. So we went there. Sure enough, the bear was there. We radio tracked in on him. He'd taken the elk quarter. We actually chased the bear on the ground with the dogs on leash, got close enough that I actually shot and hit it in the butt with a rubber bullet. Got it. It was actually carrying the hind quarter of the elk, trying to run away from us. And I just didn't want him to get the elk quarter successfully. So we chased the bear down, hit him with a rubber bullet. It dropped the elk quarter. We took the elk quarter back to the camp and secured everything properly. The bear came back into camp, continued trying to get to the elk quarters. Eric Wenham called me on radio. I was actually headed back to Schaefer to the Forest Service, and basically we got the direction to go ahead and shoot and kill the bear. And Eric went ahead and shot and killed the bear. Not a happy ending to the story, but it was one of those things that was definitely memorable because we were dealing with, a bear that was started off habituated, became food conditioned. It escalated to the point that It was going in private hunting camps, going in outfitter camps, improper food storage. The outfitter got cited for improper food storage, and ultimately we ended up with a dead bear. And so, you know, it just illustrated how things could very quickly escalate, you know, once bears get those food reports. And that's why we work so hard on trying to prevent that from happening.
You know, the staff at the foundation recently went in to do trail work at Welcome Creek to work on the CDT there along the Dearborn. And instead we ended up having to divert some of our energy to filling in the hole where a bear had excavated its way into the pit underneath the outhouse at the Welcome Creek cabin. And if you want to guess why, jars of peanut butter had been tossed in there. There was pasta. Not a fun task for us to try to fill in that hole. An example of what one person may think is an example of a good food disposal is not. That bear had dug all the way underneath the outhouse, and wasn't the pleasant work we were looking forward to say. Bryce, I want to come back to you real quick. You know, if you look at the title of the book, it's obvious. I don't want to give away too much of the book because people should go get it. It is a great read. Again, it's called Down from the Mountain, The Life and Death of a Grizzly Bear. But obviously the title gives away a little bit of it. It's not a completely heartwarming story and doesn't always have a Disney ending. Can you give us some of the follow-up to the book of, you know, there's some cubs that end up orphaned, and I've been interested. I asked you the other day, what ended up becoming of the cubs in the book, and how are they doing, if you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can sure do that. And the outcome for those cubs was that they ended up in a zoo, actually in Baltimore, Maryland. And I actually went down at one point while I was working on, you know, different drafts and visited them in the zoo. And what I found there was that they were basically receiving absolutely every bit of care and affection that people could give them. They're zookeepers, but that none of that can really replace, you know, a wild life. And so I think that just highlights how important it is for us to get some of these things right, because, you know, we as a species, we can do certain things for cubs once the parents are out, you know, if the mother's been euthanized, if the cubs are habituated and food conditioned in a way where they can't be in the wild, we can do some things for them. And putting them in a zoo is a good example of that. But even with all the resources at our disposal, we can't replace the freedom and the you know, reality of existing in a wild place like the Bob. I do want to tell, because Tim got to tell one bear story, I want to tell a bear story too.
Great, it'd be awesome.
In keeping, I guess I'm demanding equal time.
Yeah, you get as many minutes as Tim did, right? To keep
I wanted to tell the story of the Naugahyde bear. And the Naugahyde bear was a bear that I ran into when I was working on a ranch down in the Tom Minor Basin near Yellowstone. And when I got to this ranch where I would live and work, I noticed something strange, which was that every single one of the four-wheelers and the golf carts, this was a big ranch, there were lots of little vehicles, and not a single one of them had an intact seat on it. So every single piece of Naugahyde on this place was like patched in many spots with duct tape. And I finally asked, you know, what's with this? And somebody who'd worked there for a long time said, well, actually, there's this grizzly bear. And if you're out fixing fence and you leave your four-wheeler somewhere, it will come and it will tear the seat to bits. And I thought, like, that's a bizarre thing. You know, this, like, probably this is a local legend or whatever. And, but then, you know, kind of toward the fall, there was this night where there was an early snow. And I woke up in the morning to find that this bear, the Naugahyde bear, had come and walked in between the different houses on this ranch and made its way to a hot tub that had this impeccable vinyl cover. And this bear had gotten up on top of the hot tub and just had started to just go nuts, like just having the clear, like nobody saw it, but clearly I was the one who cleaned this up, clearly having the time of its life, just, you know, like scraping at it. And it went at it until it worked its way through the cover of this hot tub and then the bear plunged into, 100-degree water, at which point it, it scared the crap
Turned
out
on the
of itself.
jets, right? It turned on the jets at that point, right?
Right, and it just, no, what it actually did was turned that hot tub into the most heinous bear soup you could ever imagine.
Ooh.
But I guess what I want to say, the reason I tell that story, which is just kind of like a strange, bears with preferences story, is that these animals are individuals, and that's what's so cool about them. They have things that they like and that they don't like. And it's one thing about grizzlies is the fact that they can harm us, the fact that they can change our experience of a wilderness. That is why we attend to them and we notice them as individuals. But the crazy thing is that all the animals are out there having these fairly interesting lives and making these strange choices. But bears can let us see that clearly. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about it.
It's a great point and great story. Thanks, Bryce. So a couple more questions I want to get to with the 10 minutes we have left here. Either one of you grab this one. As a backpacker who's been in the Bob a couple of times, our group has always carried bear spray, used bear canisters, and kept a clean camp, including not tossing food and garbage into outhouses. Is there anything more as a group of backpackers we can do to ensure we do not cause a conflict?
Go ahead, Bryce. You want your time.
I was really hoping you would answer that one, because that sounds like a pretty good approach to me. If you're securing your food, if you're moving in a group, and if you're carrying bear spray, and obviously you're aware that you're sharing the landscape with these creatures, I can't think of anything specific more than that I'd recommend. I think it would be nice if there were a few food storage structures and poles back there for people who aren't carrying those canisters, but I think you're doing things right.
Yeah, I would just add, make noise. You don't have to holler all the time, but make noise, talk amongst yourself when you're in a group. I think that helps a lot. I think bears do recognize human voice. I'm not an advocate of bear bells. I know people, that was a big thing in Glacier, but I think most of the bears in the Bob Marshall have no clue what a bear bell is, but they definitely know human voice. They know livestock, the noise of horses and that kind of stuff, because a lot of that around. But make noise, so you're not coming up on a bear. At least it's going to know you're around.
Yeah, I'm going to guess in their definition of clean camp, they've already covered this, but of course, no smellies in the tent of any kind, not just food, toothpaste, nothing in your tent that could be an attractant is something I would add. And then I like to practice, obviously the golden triangle. Your area that you cook and eat in is 200 feet from where you sleep, and that combined is 200 feet from your latrine. So I think that you probably captured that by what you mean by keeping a clean camp, but I thought I'd share that piece. Christine says, with more and more people moving to the area, most will carry bear spray, but many, and I think this has got to be true, but many do not know how to accurately use it. How can we get better instructions on its proper use?
I'll comment on that, and I'm sure Bryce will follow up, but they do make inert cans of bear spray now. I would highly suggest that people purchase an inert can of bear spray and learn how to take the safety off and learn how to use it. You can do that safely. You don't have to worry about any wind blowing active bear spray back onto you or anything. But the inert cans are great. And I just encountered a guy the other day, actually, where we caught the female with the cub, that encountered a grizzly and had to use bear spray at 10 feet on her. And he said the hardest thing was getting the safety off, because he said even though he had practiced with it some, he wasn't proficient at it. And I think it's like anything, the more you practice with it, the better. An inert can is great, but even an empty can of bear spray is good to practice with, knowing where it's at on your body, carry it in the same place, have it with you on your person. Don't have it on the back of your pack, because when you lay your backpack down to go do something, it's not with you. And so that's what I recommend. And then practice, know how to take the safety off, know how to spray it, how far it goes. Bryce, you want to add anything?
I would echo what you said, and I would just say, keep it accessible. Yeah. Because it's so often you do see what Tim was just describing, which is people walking around with it clipped like back where the water bottle goes on your backpack. And if you think about the way that bear encounters often unfold, the kind of bear encounter in which you would use bear spray, there is no time to hunt for that thing. So it has to be within, you know, a really easy swipe of the hand. Practice with it, like you said. And then I guess the last thing I would add is respect the fact that bear spray is durable, but it's not, it's susceptible to heat. So you wouldn't want to, I've been in a truck where someone left one on a dashboard and it blew up. And if you've ever had that happen to you, you will never forget it, because it's extremely potent stuff. It does work. But there's something to be said for taking good care of that can, and, you know, not letting it overheat, not letting it get a puncture in it. You know you're carrying around something that is both potent and can pop. But they don't do that very often. You can do a lot to them.
Yeah, great feedback too on where to keep it. Don't have it where it's hard. I keep mine on my sternum strap on my pack, so it's right here. So one final question, and then we'll wrap things up. And Tim, I know this is outside your territory, but you might have this answer, and Bryce, you as well. What grizzly bear protection efforts exist in partnership with the Blackfeet Nation?
Well, we work a lot with the Blackfeet Nation in terms of their bear management program. Dan Carney, who's now retired, we work very closely with him. He was there for years and years. They do have a bear conflict specialist over there. They've gone through some changes. It's been challenging, but they're basically have pretty good food storage order. They've been working on getting bear resistant garbage containers into place for people, and they have pretty good law enforcement with their wardens on enforcing their food storage orders that they have. And their program is not a whole lot different than the other state management programs or the program down on the Flathead Indian Reservation, like with Stacy Corville. They do relocate bears that they've caught occasionally over onto my area and also into Glacier National Park, but we also jointly monitor those bears.
Thanks. Well, guys, we have just a couple minutes. Bryce, what's the future in your working with grizzly bears? What do you get up in the morning thinking about?
Well, I guess for us right now, the future, a lot of it centers on the degree to which we can help bears make this trip from the Northern Continental Divide to, in my case, the Selway Bitterroot ecosystem, because there's a huge complex down there. The Selway Bitterroot, adjoins the Frank Church River of No Return. That's the largest roadless area left in the lower 48. And there's some quite good grizzly habitat in there. And we're just starting to see the first, bears make that crossing. And it's really exciting. So for me, it's looking at how do some of these small practical projects add up to something big like connectivity and reconnection of historic habitat. That's what animates me in terms of bear work right now.
Tim? Probably more relocations, I'm guessing.
What do I wake up in the morning thinking about? It's like, well, what calls am I going to get today, and what am I going to end up having to do? How many chickens got killed last night at somebody's house, and did their grain bin get broken into, and garbage cans in Columbia Falls get tipped over? And we've got a lot of grizzly bears right now in the valleys, in the lower elevations. They're hungry. It's hyperphagia time, and they're trying to put on that last little bit of fat to get into the dens. And everybody has trail cameras, game cameras nowadays, and with the new snow on the ground, everybody's seeing tracks. So we're getting a lot of calls because all of a sudden there's tracks showing up in people's backyards, and they actually know that. And so they're calling us about that. So that's why I didn't wake up. What am I going to be doing tomorrow?
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both. Bryce Andrews, again, author of Down from the Mountain. Tim Manley, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Thanks for joining us tonight for our conversation about bears in and around the Bob. I want to thank all of you who've joined us. The great questions that you've asked us tonight. You've made this hour and a half fly by. I want to again point you to our website, bmwf.org, for our auction that goes on for another week, wraps up a week from tonight. Also the raffle that we will stop selling tickets a week from tonight as well. So great way to support our work and also find a nice piece of art for your wall or maybe a great trip for you to plan this winter or next spring as well. So again, thanks guys for joining us tonight. Really great conversation. Week from tonight, we will be joined by a full slate of guests to talk about the 80-year history of the bob and the pre-European history of the land. And we'll hope you'll join us for our final fireside chat as part of Voices of the Wilderness at Home. Again, Tim and Bryce, thanks guys. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody soon. We have recorded tonight and we'll be sharing that soon. So if you know somebody who would like to have seen it and missed it, we'll be sharing that soon on our social media channels, and people will be able to watch a recording of tonight's presentation. So thanks guys.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.